Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive. Today, we're heading into medieval India, specifically between 1336 and 1646 CE. Now, we're not just talking about empires rising and falling, though there's plenty of that. It's more about how they interacted. Trade, diplomacy, culture, it all played a role. Imagine this. A Roman gold coin ends up all the way in southern India. How'd that happen? Well, stick with us, and by the end of this deep dive, you'll understand how these exchanges shaped Indian society and left their mark even on the India we know today.
It truly is a fascinating period, and these interactions were more intricate than many realize.
So let's start with the basics. We're talking about a huge area here. How were people and goods actually moving around? Was it all like camels and caravans?
Well, there were certainly camels and caravans, especially on those northern plains. But the rivers, don't forget the rivers, they were vital, especially in the south. Picture bustling ports, ships loaded with spices, textiles, even horses going to and from distant lands.
So not just one Silk Road, but this whole network of roads.
Exactly. And just like the Silk Road, these routes weren't just about the goods. They carried ideas, beliefs, artistic styles, the whole package.
Wow, that's amazing. So we're not just talking about economics here. What about the cultural side of things?
Oh, absolutely. Take, for instance, the Periplus Maris Erythrae. It's an ancient Roman document that mentions Muziris, a port on the Malabar coast. Big trading hub with Rome it was. And you know what the Romans loved? Indian pepper. They were crazy for it. In fact, huge hoards of Roman gold coins have been found near Muziris.
So this wasn't just some small-time spice trade. We're talking a major economic force connecting empires across continents.
Exactly. And that kind of trade inevitably brings people of different cultures together. And when that happens, they leave their mark on each other. Think about the Sultanate era. The influence of Persian art and architecture is undeniable. Those incredible mosques and palaces with their intricate domes and arches and calligraphy, a beautiful blend of Islamic aesthetics and traditional Indian craftsmanship.
So it's not just spices and silks being traded, but artistic ideas and architectural techniques too.
Absolutely. When Islam arrived in India, it set off this fascinating cultural exchange. Sometimes it was harmonious, other times, well, not so much. Take the Jizya tax, for example. That was imposed on non-Muslims during that time. A controversial policy, no doubt, but it highlights the complexities of cultural integration. It wasn't always smooth sailing.
It sounds like navigating those cultural differences was just as important as managing the economics. Did these empires ever clash, or were they mostly peaceful neighbors?
Well, it was a bit of both, to be honest. Diplomacy, you see, was key in this era. Rulers, they used all sorts of strategies, marriages, alliances, and yes, sometimes military campaigns were necessary to hold on to their power.
So it was like a constant balancing act, trying to maintain power while also keeping an eye on everyone else.
Exactly, and some were better at it than others. The Chola Dynasty, for example, they were known for their naval power. Their expeditions, those weren't just about conquest, they were strategic, disrupting trade monopolies, and gaining control over those lucrative shipping routes.
So they were playing the long game, realizing that economic power went hand in hand with political dominance. But how did all this impact everyday people? Was it all about emperors and elites, or did these exchanges, trickle down to society at large?
Oh, those effects were definitely felt at all levels. Everything from religious practices to economic opportunities was shaped by the relationships between these empires. The Sultanate's economic policies, for instance, they had ripple effects throughout their territories.
What were some of those key policies, and how do they shape the economic landscape?
Well, the Sultanate, they relied heavily on agricultural taxes. Farmers would have to hand over a portion of their harvest to the government.
Makes sense, a steady stream of revenue. But that could be a burden on farmers, couldn't it? Especially if the harvests were bad or taxes were high.
That's right. It's a delicate balance, isn't it? Funding the government without overburdening the people. But remember, the Sultanate also controlled certain trade monopolies. So that could stimulate demand for agricultural goods, potentially benefiting those very same farmers.
True, true. Higher demand, potentially higher prices. It's a reminder that economic policies, they often have unintended consequences, and different groups feel those consequences in different ways. It really highlights just how complex governing can be, especially in a region as diverse and interconnected as India. But we've talked about cultural exchanges. What about on a more personal level? How do they play out?
It's easy to get caught up in those grand displays of cultural blending, those magnificent mosques and palaces. But it's crucial to remember cultural exchange wasn't always smooth sailing. That Jizya tax, for example, it created a clear division within society, highlighting the difference between that ruling Muslim elite and the non-Muslim populations,
Yeah.
which you can imagine led to some tension, some resentment.
So even as these architectural styles and artistic ideas were being shared, there were these like underlying social and religious tensions just simmering beneath the surface.
Exactly. And those tensions, well, they could spill over into the economic realm as well. I mean, trust is the foundation of trade. If there's a lack of trust between different communities, well, economic growth can be stifled, like trying to build a house on, I don't know, a foundation that's constantly shifting.
It's a powerful analogy. Really shows how those cultural and economic factors are all intertwined, each one influencing the other in sometimes unpredictable ways. We can't just focus on those grand narratives of empires and trade routes without thinking about the human element, the individuals navigating these complex realities. What stands out to you as a particularly striking example of this interplay between culture, economics, and those individual lives?
Well, the story of that jizya tax itself really comes to mind. It brought in revenue for the Sultanate, sure, but it also became the symbol, of division, social and religious division. Just imagine being a non-Muslim, a merchant maybe, or an artisan back then. You're contributing to the economy, maybe even doing well, but then there's this tax, this constant reminder that you're not quite equal.
Yeah, it's a real example of how a policy, even one meant to help the economy, can end up having these unintended consequences, social and cultural ones. But let's shift gears a bit. What about legacy? The Sultanate? It eventually gives way to the Mughal Empire. Does its influence just disappear? Or are there lasting impacts on Indian society?
Oh, the Sultanate's impact is undeniable. Take architecture, for example.
Yeah.
That Indo-Islamic style that we see emerge. The fusion of Islamic and Indian elements. It didn't just vanish. It kept evolving, inspiring those later architectural marvels.
So those grand mosques and palaces, they're not just impressive buildings, they're like blueprints, shaping the aesthetic landscape for centuries.
Exactly. And it's not just architecture. The Persian language, it became widespread during the Sultanate. It was a language of administration, literature, high culture. Kind of like, how English spread during the British colonial era.
So Persian became like this language of power and prestige, leaving its mark on Indian languages and literature.
Precisely. It enriched the vocabulary, influenced grammar, even shaped literary styles. It's another part of the Sultanate's legacy woven into the fabric of Indian culture.
It's amazing to think about how something from centuries ago can still have such a big impact on the world today.
And don't forget, the Sultanate wasn't isolated. It was part of this massive network. Trade, diplomacy, stretching from the Middle East all the way to China, all those connections, they brought more than just goods. Ideas flowed, technologies, artistic styles, all coming into India.
It's like this giant tapestry, threads of influence from every direction, adding to the richness and diversity of Indian culture.
Exactly. And that's what makes studying this era so fascinating. It reminds us that history isn't just about isolated events, it's about connection. It's about how different cultures, different empires interact, shaping the course of human civilization.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes. Medieval India, it wasn't static or isolated. It was dynamic, full of exchange, innovation, transformation. What's the one thing you hope our listeners will take away from this?
Well, I'd say it's the importance of looking deeper. When we study history, it's easy to get caught up in those big stories, the empires, the conquests. But it's just as important to think about the everyday people, the cultural exchanges, the economic policies, how it all fits together to create the past.
Beautifully said. So for our listeners, as you go about your day, think about those hidden connections all around you. The food you eat, the clothes you wear, the languages you speak, the buildings you admire, they all have stories. Stories that connect us to the past, reminding us of the legacy of human interaction. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.